This, of course, is our 750th anniversary of the foundation of our college, Merton College. Our college statutes have served as a template for other colleges through time and throughout the world, and we are immensely proud of this. And in fact, I shall say a little bit more on this later tonight. We have put together a very full and varied programme of celebratory events, and it's our intention very much to use these events to bring together the whole Merton family right over the world. The Merton Conversations are one of the main elements of these anniversary celebrations, and what they do is they offer a forum to discuss some of the world's major issues. In an effort to reach out to the worldwide Merton community, 2 of these conversations take place outside the United Kingdom. The first was in Hong Kong, and this was on the topic of the challenges of global finance. And then the second one outside the United Kingdom, of course, is here today in New York, and our chosen theme is the global media revolution. So we see that these 2 conversations have a particularly global aspect to them. After this, the Merton Conversations then return to the United Kingdom, and in fact the last 3 will take place in London. But I like to stress that all these conversations should be podcast, so you'll be able to view them on the Merton website in due time. We're now getting towards the middle of our celebrations, so I'd like to just quickly remind you that in terms of big events, we've also got a summer ball coming up on June the 28th, and a special birthday weekend on the 12th through to the 14th. The 14th of September, of course, is Merton's birthday. And then, in addition, I must mention that there are numerous excellent musical events going on throughout the year. A good anniversary, though, turns on 2 things. It turns on the celebrations, which I've just said a few words about, and on fundraising. So, before I welcome the 2 discussants and their moderator, I'd just like to give you a very brief update on the way that the campaign is. As you will know, we have a goal of attaining £30 million to help secure the college for the next stage in its history. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to announce that at the moment we are at £28 million towards that £30 million. So we're doing very well, but there's one last heave required. And I will thank you in advance for your support on this. All donations matter to us, be they large or be they small. And that's why there's another goal that we have. We track our participation rate. That is to say, the percentage of Mertonians who give something in the course of a particular year. I didn't check the numbers, but I'm going from memory here. I think last year our participation rate was 34.7%, and we were second, I think. But our goal in our anniversary year is to attain 40% participation. And this would put us top of the league table, and this would please the warden greatly, I would like you to know. At the moment, though, we are at participation rate of 18%, and the way things go is the census is taken July to July. So you can see there's a little bit of work to be done. And again, I risk my neck in this and say, and I thank you in advance. Anyway, back to tonight's Merton Conversation. I'd like firstly to thank both of our discussants, Howard and Mark, for making tonight's Merton Conversation possible. In a few moments, our moderator, John Kirby, will introduce Howard and Mark fully. But before that happens, I just wanted to say a few words of introduction about John Kirby, our moderator. John was a Rhodes Scholar at Merton. He also studied at Fordham, and he was also a professor at the University of Virginia Law School. A few days ago, John was telling me of his work on the President's Law Commission on campus unrest. This was after the events on Kent State University, and that sort of point in time a little further back. But I just want to say, I think it's a very wonderful thing to have contributed to public life at such a high level. Nearer to home, in the Merton family is what I mean, John has been president of MC3 since 2004. So for these reasons, and for many other reasons besides, I think that John is the perfect choice of moderator for tonight's Merton Conversation. So now can I ask you to give a big round of applause to John Kirby, our moderator.
Thank you, Martin. I was waiting with bated breath to see who would take the seat on the right. As you can tell from what the warden said in describing the conversations, Merton does not shy away from big topics. And big topics, of course, do have problems. It's very hard to cover a big topic in an hour or a week or a month or even a period of years. But I can't imagine two more qualified people to discuss the global revolution, the global media revolution, or global digital revolution than Howard and Mark. It is, for me, really absolutely almost unbelievable that Merton College in 1962 or 61 saw Howard matriculate, and 15 years later saw Mark matriculate, really at the early stages, and in Howard's case, maybe prehistoric for the digital revolution. And now their careers, all we have to do is let them tell their story, and you'll find out what happened during this incredible revolution that we have lived through, many of us with them, and where they are going to help guide it as it goes forward. As most of you know, Howard began his career as a researcher at CBS News in the early 60s. He rose through the ranks at CBS, making it a very important name for himself on the firing lines of making documentaries, which seems to be somewhat of a lost art this day. But this was in the days when networks actually sponsored and controlled and had people on their payroll to go out and make documentaries. And he made documentaries that range from covering Lyndon Johnson to covering the Vietnam War to covering Ireland, and he had worked with some of the most famous commentators in American television. And then we all thought, who were his friends, that he had probably reached the pinnacle of his profession, and in many ways he had. But you went to sleep and woke up, and the next thing you knew, he was no longer doing documentaries. He was in hard news. He was editing and executive editor of the CBS Evening News. And from that, he became president of the news, president of CBS, at a few detours, which he perhaps will get into during the course of this discussion, and then his career as the Welsh-born leader of a major Japanese company from which he has recently stepped down. Mark began his career after Merton, again, at an entry-level position at the BBC. And he very quickly rose through the ranks of the BBC, Channel 4, and by the beginning of the 21st century, he was poised to become Director General of the BBC. And it was from there that the New York Times, in its wisdom, decided that it needed someone who had media skills, digital skills, but a man who had a first in English from Oxford University and journalistic skills. And he has now, since that time, been the president and chief executive officer of the New York Times, where he is leading a digital revolution that arrives, at least in my mailbox, my digital mailbox, pretty much every day. I can now subscribe to New York Times Now. I can now subscribe to become a premier subscriber. I should note that some of these actually come free. Others, there's now a charge for. Some of them contain only Times content, some are aggregations. So again, we see Mark having just lived on both sides of the Atlantic, Howard on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and of course, Mark with BBC Worldwide, and Howard, who's now involved with BBC Worldwide. So we have two Mertonians. This is the first conversation where there have been two Mertonians. Each of these two is also an honorary fellow of Merton. Really quite extraordinary. Here we are, and I think there are many, many topics to cover. Today, there was a story on the internet that said the number of people reading has dropped by 300% since 1978. And were books now dead? That, of course, comes as a little bit of a blow to those of us who have graduated from a place with a library like Merton's. So let me ask, Mark, are books dead?
No, I don't think they are. I think bookstores struggle. I think that maybe not in Oxford and England, maybe not in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and New York City, but I think it's part of the habit of browsing through bookshops may go. But my sense is that children, young people of my children's generation, this is the kind of Harry Potter generation, discovered great storytelling in books, which in a way was as big an event for them as any video game or movie. Books, I personally think physical books will last many decades as well. Clearly, quite often people are going to read things on digital devices. But I think we're living in an age actually of great writing, particularly great children's writing. And I think that we often have in our head that sense of, once there were horses and carriages, then there were cars, that one medium just gets wiped out by another. I think the story of media is different. That radio was not destroyed by television. The movies were not destroyed by television. That these things coexist, and people are sophisticated, and they in a life it's like the New York Times. I mean, 80% of our print subscribers authenticate and use the digital products as well. They're not print readers, they're print and digital. And it's common sense that first thing in the morning, at night, at the weekend, the physical newspaper or the magazines are the easiest and best way of reading the information. If you're in the subway or in a train on the way to work, a smartphone or a tablet might be better. And so, in a way, people are, human beings are very clever at using different devices and different displays for what they're best at. Right? So I think coexistence. Now, if you ask a slightly different question, which is about the economics, obviously one of the big things that's happened is that economics have changed. But I think the movies are a good example where, an industry which was meant to be wiped out by television in the 1950s has adapted and changed its economics. And although Hollywood's going through quite a tough time again right now, for decades, Hollywood's been very clever in how they've used other media. They've used TV, they've used DVDs, they've used downloads and services like Netflix to get as much value out of their intellectual property as they can.
Thank you, Mark. Howard, Mark touched on a number of topics, each of which you have had to personally deal with during your career.
I have the scars to prove it.
That's which Blu-ray or
She was fine.
Howard, do you want to take us a little bit through your career and how these changes affected what you were doing, what you were interested in doing?
Yeah, I just want to say something about Mark, because actually the Times today has a good story on how Seattle's bookstores are beginning to come back, run by many of the ex-Amazon executives who got fed up with digital books. So don't be so sure that tastes won't change back. You will all remember the CB radio craze. And I thought that the ultimate nightmare was to actually have a CB radio, which I never got round to. But they died, and nobody has a CB radio. So when you think of books, people carried Harry Potter around. My son tried to get into Eton, which was a joke, really. And he carried his Harry Potter books into the school as he was being interviewed, whereas all the other kids were carrying Herodotus and Ovid and so forth. And my son was carrying Harry Potter, but he had actually read it, which the other kids had clearly not read Herodotus. And so there are certain levels of books that are coming back. I mean, it is true. I was at a business school in France, and I asked everybody in the class, how many of you read a newspaper today? Not one of them. Not one of them. And I found that a bit depressing. But times, pendulums swing, and I don't give... The other thing about the New York Times, which he won't tell you, is that the New York Times is showing real signs of life in the sale of subscriptions. The idea of getting you to read 3 stories and then tricking you into buying another subscription, which, by the way, they never let me do. I don't understand that. But I think it's brilliant, and it's clearly...
I'm happy to take cash right now, Howard.
Yeah. Would that I had some. But I think the Times is probably not written about this yet, but I hear from all my merry sources that the Times is gone through that revolution and is now making more money off digital than it is off print. And if that's true, I have one piece of advice for you, Mark. Take credit for it while you can. Don't hesitate to nod at this crowd and say, I've had a good month.
Yeah.
What was it?
One of the morals is you're unquestionably often going to get blamed for things which you're not responsible for, so you better take credit for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What was the question?
Well, Howard, I was actually, in a sense, asking you to divide in two the things you were rightly praised for, the things you were rightly blamed for as you lived through the revolution.
Yeah, which you get blamed for everything. I mean, I think my career, I started as you said, a documentary producer, which is a relatively obvious career if you could get it. In those days, there were 3 networks, and you stood in line and you waited for someone to die, and then you moved up the chain, and that was the way things were. And I did get the research. I was a researcher at the age of 30 and was mildly suicidal, thinking, how do I go back to Merton and tell him I'm still a researcher? How do I tell you? I kept away from you for at least 2 years. By the way, he doesn't tell you, but he was the first Mertonian of his year to get a job before he graduated, which irritated all of us. But I had those jobs, documentary producer, and I thought people who had those jobs in those days had them for life. They were careers. And I was part of a generation that watched this disintermediation start to happen. All of a sudden, as you said, I was doing 20 documentaries a year for the company, and then it was 10. And then with my biggest success, it went down to 5. And then I was on the evening news, which I thought was a big step up, which was very exciting, the most exciting job I ever had. And we had the market share of 26%, which is now 8%. And the reason it was because disintermediation. The companies stopped moved our program to different time zones, fragmentation, and so forth. So you suddenly realize that, wait a minute, I can't do this forever because the share's too small and it's no longer so influential. And I became president of the news division, and that was miserable because we were laying people off all over the place. And when I complained about that, they made me president of the company. Mostly because I'd actually laid people off. I thought they said, maybe he'll do it again. But the business we're in, now, as you can see on a much bigger scale, everything gets disintermediated. And you either adapt or die. And sometimes you do adapt, and sometimes you don't feel like adapting, and you stay where you are. But you know, I said to somebody the other day, when you think about it, I was drafted by the Americans, I've been networked, I've been Googled, I've been everything by the new media, and you're still hanging on because something will come along. So just when you think somebody is going to be around forever, and the best example of that is the big conference in Davos, because I remember when I became president of CBS, I was on the panel, I was on the front deck with the Hollywood studios, and we were a big deal. 2 years later, you couldn't get arrested. You weren't invited onto the stage because AOL was on the stage and Yahoo was on the stage, and they were all on the stage, and we were in a side room. And then poor Yahoo and AOL, they're all gone, and then it's Google, and then it's Facebook, and then they come and go. Bits stay, but most of the big companies come and go, and that's the nature of disintermediation. There's always somebody waiting to take your position. And I think, with the exception of the Times, whose position really hasn't been taken, though its circulation has dropped, the difficulty of running companies in this age is that you have to do that. And if you don't pay attention, if you don't watch it, the ghosts come and get you, and you're dragged off into the corridors and forgotten. But it is very exciting, but change is the natural order of things.
Well, Howard, I think, again, you've raised some issues which I'm not sure they run counter to what Mark said or maybe support it, but I'm very interested in your comment when you asked, had any of these young people read a newspaper that day? When you talk about cross-platforms, Mark, do you really think that high school students today read a newspaper at all?
There was never a golden age where you know, there were high school students reading the Financial Times and the Economist from kindergarten upwards. The New York Times. I mean, this revolution is a really interesting moment in human history. The New York Times is read by 50 million people every month. That was never true in its heyday. In its heyday, the New York Times, for much of its life, was a New York City newspaper. You couldn't buy it in Long Island. You couldn't buy it in New Jersey. It was for the city of New York. Then it became a regional newspaper, then a national newspaper. Now it's 50 million people. I mean, the other side of what's happened is that the barriers to content between different countries, different geographies, have fallen completely. And the world's access to information and news is more broad, there's more choice, more plurality than there's ever been. Now, you know, for almost every incumbent, it's the devil's own, job working out how you think about that, how you exploit it, how you don't get destroyed by it, for all the reasons Howard said. And I think there's something else which is, I think, relevant to Merton, which is if you're sitting, because this is, don't know exactly how or when it's coming, this is coming to the world of universities as well at a fair rate of knots. If you have an institution which has a fantastic reputation, it's got a wonderful brand, we call it a brand, but it means a reputation for excellence. CBS News will be an example, Sony will be an example, the BBC is an example, New York Times is an example. You've got a dilemma, and the dilemma basically is, it's agreed, it's a Ming vase, it's a wonderful thing, you've got to preserve it. But you can't preserve it unless you're prepared to somehow confront these extraordinary changes which are happening. And so I think one of the biggest tasks for the folks who are trying to figure out what you do and trying to lead organisations is which which bits don't you change, which bits are there to be preserved, and which bits have you got to confront and change. And I'll tell you now, there'll be people inside the organisation, outside the organisation, arguing passionately that every single thing should stay exactly the same.
Yeah.
And it's somebody else who should change. Maybe the public should change, the customer should change, the commercial partner should change. And I think one of the biggest things that we both, I think, found ourselves dealing with is that trying to work out how you have to run with the Ming vase and not drop it. And you somehow have to bring people with you as you do
Which,
that.
by the way, is in the New York Times again today. I mean, the New York Times today might have known about this conference because it talks about the innovator's dilemma that Christensen from Harvard picked up on, which means that if you don't watch out, you're too busy. When you're too big, you're protecting the past at the expense of the future. Yeah. And I mean, Bill Clinton's had a great line about big companies. When companies become too big, he said, they're like running a cemetery. You have thousands of people underneath you, but nobody's listening. And I certainly felt that at Sony because they were also listening in Japanese, which made it even harder. I don't think they know that I've gone.
Oh, Howard. One of the things that I'm very puzzled by, it's clear that the New York Times is presenting, using the very elitist newspaper, which the Times is, and is presenting its readers choice, many more choices than they had before. They can consume in different ways, and in some ways consume different products that have media or pictures associated with the word. And this is something that the proliferation of choice is clearly not unique to the Times. And just as in brand studies, sometimes they say that the more choice doesn't make people happier, it makes them confused and more likely just to stick with one thing that they know. Do you think that more choice is leading to people sampling more? Do you think people zero in and pick and then never can be changed?
Well, I think there isn't a simple answer to that question. I mean, I think at the heart of it, the proposition of a news provider is very, very simple, and it matters most when really, really big stories happen. 9/11 would be an example of that, which is that people want to be told what's happening and to be given some sense of how do you understand it? How does it fit into a context? What is it going to mean? What's likely to happen next? And I think at the most profound level, actually, we would want at the Times to try and do that in a simple, straightforward way. And we recognise that how that plays out will vary a little bit by, whether you're going to see it in the physical newspaper, if you're going to see it on a tablet, if you're going to see it on an iPhone. But I think at the simplest level, you want to actually keep things very simple. But it's true that we're trying to fit our news into people's needs and lifestyles. And in the same way, I mean, once upon a time, Mercedes would maybe have 3 models. Now nobody knows how many models they've got. They tweak and they can very cleverly adapt subtly different models and lines for particular needs, different sizes of family, different countries and different markets and so on. And I think that you can find us doing that, but it's not really trying to confuse people. I mean, and I think the fundamental proposition of something like the Times or the BBC is very simple, which is high quality, properly researched news with journalists who've hopefully had enough time to kind of think things through, enough thinking time. So I think in a way, certainly I think if the complexity confuses either readers or frankly confuses the people inside the organisation, then that's not unknown as well, that the people inside the organisation have no clue what they're meant to be doing because there's so many different things going on and so many different things to feed. There was a moment I ran the BBC News operation during the Tiananmen Square crisis in China in 1989. It's a long time ago, but there was a day when I asked the guys who were doing the editing, how many pieces have we sent in the last 24 hours? And the answer was like 33 pieces in 24 hours. And you could just see the beginning of this monster wanting to be fed every hour of the day and night, television, radio, and you know, in a few years' time, the web. And I think the kind of mental exhaustion that comes from that inside organisations is an interesting issue as well.
It's tricky.
What it has been said that we now have reached an age where there is so much choice, not just on the method of consumption, but so many different producers of news, whether we call it journalism or not, so many producers of information that people no longer read what they need to know.
I don't believe that. I mean, I think if we could transport ourselves to Oxford and you walked into the Bodleian Library, they've got more books and manuscripts than anyone is ever going to be able to read. And yet people go in there every day of the week and they find exactly, I mean, certainly my day used to take a while sometimes, but in the end they will find what they want. And we've got a way of navigating our way through libraries or big bookshops and finding what we need. Yeah. And we don't think a bookshop which has got, or a library which has got 50,000 volumes is worse than one that's got 5,000 because it's confusing. We think it's better because actually it's got more knowledge and there's more chance of finding exactly what you want. The challenge is navigation. The challenge is that our way of finding what we want is immature, and the technology for helping us find what we want is not great either. I mean, the first time you used Google and you put in a search term and it came back and said the good news is you've got 30 million answers in 0.21 seconds. You thought that's really clever, but 30 million answers is not that helpful. You want one or two clear answers. So I think it's partly it's an immature environment for finding what you want.
You get a lot of information. The Arab Spring is a good example.
Yeah.
Only 5% of the people had access to digital anything, and rumors spread and so forth. And they had a lot of information, but no one was able to package and explain everything. So in the end, they don't know. The problem with the social networks is that they encourage people to believe the same thing. So you've now got media that is polarized in a peculiar way. Fox is about conservatives, MSNBC is about liberals, and all the others are scattered all over the place. And so finding a way to navigate that is why the Times will always have value, but on the other hand, it's very confusing out in the mainstream of social media.
Is it fair to say, and this is really to either of you, that the consumer has to want to navigate? He has to want to learn more, and he has to want to move beyond what he's being fed by Fox News or any other single source?
Well, I think it adds on to something really important, which I think is, I'm not persuaded that kind of too much choice is a problem. I think that the internet and the digital thing definitely makes it easier for people just to kind of restrict themselves to opinions which reinforce their own and not to be confronted by other perspectives and other ways of looking at the world.
Which is happening in politics.
And I mean, both in this country, I think in the UK as well, you can feel that reinforcing it, that kind of cycle reinforcing itself. And I think that's troubling really, because I think that one of the core parts of an education, not just a formal education, but the education of the rest of your life, is being kind of forced in your daily life to rub up against new, different, maybe even unwelcome kind of thoughts and opinions. And I think that's an important part of a kind of civilized world, and I think that is a worry. And obviously, you hope that things like the New York Times, that we try and do that. I mean, I don't think we always do it as well as we could, by the way, but you want to encounter opinions which are not your opinions, as well as I'm sure sometimes finding people who do agree with you.
I think obviously some people would disagree that the does that, but I think most fair people would say the Times does a better job than almost any other historic newspaper. But we still are in a society where the New York Times, and Howard has proved that he's an avid reader, that a couple of days ago, your columnist Frank Bruni was writing about the water cooler effect and how the water cooler was an important integrative force in society. And it's gone because no one has anything in common to talk about the water cooler. Do you agree with him?
I think we as a society, because there's so much information, that also means we worry more than we should. When you're deluged with information, it tends to make you anxious and nervous. But I don't know that people know less. I mean, I have two children who are far from academic. My son still has the Harry Potter book.
And he's 39.
And he has finished. But I am the most peculiar part of your children when you watch. I have two teenagers, or one is actually 21, one's 17. You don't know how they read. My son has astonishing information. I mean, we were at an event and we met a Supreme Court justice there, and my son engaged him in a critical analysis of the other members of the Supreme Court. Yeah. And my son is right wing, which is disturbing for me. So I don't know. I said, when did you learn all this? So people find out things. They may well be, these kids may well be more independent than they ever were. I mean, look at the number of people that are dropping out of school to become entrepreneurs. Yeah. So maybe there's something in this millennium generation that we haven't really understood, and we're still judging them by our own experiences. But I'm quite dazzled by some of the successful stories that you hear out there in the real world, where people are not going to university because it gets in the way. They're in too much of a hurry.
Nevertheless, Howard, there is a huge body of literature now, from Coming Apart to other books of that ilk, that basically talk about the fabric of U.S. society disintegrating because, among other things, we no longer have three networks that form the basis for conversation. So is that, and they then accuse, they don't accuse, but they say that the polarization we have now is a result of that common theater not being available.
I'm not so sure. For one thing, the issue of that is a lot about politicians. People who become politicians, which is in England is a phenomenon. They're all professional politicians now. Nobody's actually had a job. And that was unexpected. And there are terrible consequences of that, I suspect. Less true here. But back in the days, I always remember coming into the morning news one day and seeing, this is some time ago, and seeing Solzhenitsyn being interviewed by our crack correspondent, who thought he was the head of the agriculture department, and said to him, I remember saying to him, what do you think of the problem of wheat in Kansas? And Solzhenitsyn was not understanding what you're talking about. Who is this man? Yeah. And so people didn't always know everything. And the network news, we got a lot of credit because we were the only game in town. But I got a job once for the silliest of reasons. I was on a panel. I was president of the news division, and somebody from the audience said to a whole bunch of network executives, do you think cable channels will be a force for the future? And everybody said no, because people like the networks the way they are. People like the networks, they're happy with the program, they're satisfied. And I'm at the end of the line and I'm saying, God, I hope not. I don't think so. I think people like choice, and they will want choice. And when they get choice, they'll want more choice. And 3 weeks later, I was president of the network. And I shouldn't have been.
Well, people might differ about that, Howard, but I go back to, you talked about the Arab Spring, and we talked about sort of the common bond that the networks had. We don't have the common bond. We have however many people directly had access to digital media during the Arab Spring, it's certainly, digital media certainly got a lot of credit for spreading the news about where people were gathering and what they were saying and doing.
Yeah.
So we really, whether it be social media or the media in general, with literally thousands, millions of choices, it does not seem to have produced a more open and democratic society anywhere,
Fair enough.
much the United States, but anywhere in the world.
But you know, you talk about the Arabs, the whole point about the Arab Spring really was that we encouraged revolution inadvertently. We told them about that they had democracy, but nobody ever explained the difficulties of democracy and what the transition would be like. We sort of liberated them, and they didn't know what we were liberating them to. And that happened all over the Middle East. In the end, it may be okay. They may struggle to a democracy, but we were sort of naive, and we expected democracy to happen once we announced it. And maybe that's social media's fault. I don't know. But I think in general, it's part of the excitement of the age we live in. Information is flowing everywhere, and that's not a bad thing.
And it's worth saying that the most repressive societies still prefer to limit information. I mean, in China, in Iran, in Russia, there are very deliberate attempts to limit choice of media. So at least the leaders in those countries believe there is a correlation to some extent between, in a sense, political choice and media choice.
I'm not sure anyone would disagree with that. I don't think Howard would. I certainly wouldn't. But as Warden noted, I made my living as a lawyer, and I did litigation.
All right.
So thank you. It was another day, a different age, and one of the tactics that lawyers, devious lawyers, would do is if someone asked for information and you knew that in that information there were damaging things, you said, okay, you want that, fine, here's 10,000 things. Now try and figure out what it is you really want. And I think there's in many people's mind, there's a real analogy to what's going on now. Information is being dumped from many sources, many channels, and people they can't and don't want to go through the effort of trying to work their way through it. And how is the global media revolution going to deal with that? How are we going to help people?
What's interesting, I mean, I'm told that once there was a tradition in American high schools of teaching kids how to read newspapers, including how to fold the newspaper. So you could, if you were in a train or something, you could read it efficiently. And I think today there's a really interesting question for educationalists about whether, in addition to what schools already do, which is teaching kids how to use the internet for effective research, but how you can teach and work with young people so that they're thinking hard about choice and also, as it were, the motives and kind of what lies behind a lot of the media they see. And I'm not sure we do. I don't think in the UK we do a very good job at that. And I wonder how good a job is done here, because certainly part of being an effective and competent citizen is going to be somehow making sense of vast amounts of often very bewildering data. I think that's right.
And we tell them to go, we're telling them all to do maths and engineering, and we need more mathematicians, and yet all the people we knew, if you announced that you were going into engineering when we were at Oxford, people would have looked at you strangely.
Yeah.
Whereas now all we need is engineers. And so at the same time we criticize them for not reading the newspapers, and we're also telling them, go do engineering.
Yeah. Well, so there's an interesting point there about the humanities, really, and about the kind of critical faculties that are associated with the humanities, in which Merton stands for a tradition stretching back to the Middle Ages of incredibly clever, sophisticated thinkers in a particular culture. using incredibly profound gifts of analysis and you know, generators of argument and philosophy and so forth, Duns Scotus and Merton and others.
And none of them wanted to make money, so they could give them to the warden.
It's true. It's true. And the issue for us really is what is, you know, is some of the idea of what the humanities are, and that idea of not, as it were, mathematical analysis, but the analysis of words and ideas. To what extent is that a missing piece in education? I think is interesting.
Well, I think you and Howard will both agree that, though the warden might not, that some of the stress on mathematics and science does have, there's perhaps a downside. There's only so much available time in the classroom, and we have to. But what I am very curious to understand how elite institutions like the Times, and indeed like the BBC, how do elite institutions teach or work with or compete for public attention outside their already trained elite audiences? How do they attract other people when there's thousands and thousands of choices? It's not a question of saying, will you read the New York Times as well as the Daily News? There are a million things they could read.
So, I mean, the BBC is an interesting case because although the BBC is an elite institution, in the UK, here the BBC is regarded as, I mean, rightly in terms of consumption in America as a, you know, in a set of choices, you might come to the BBC for certain particular things, international news or costume drama. But in the UK, BBC reaches 95% of the population. The average amount of time someone in that 95% spends in the BBC with the BBC is about 18 and a half hours a week. Mm. Extraordinary. I mean, people spend more time on the BBC than they spend eating. You know, and for the BBC, I think the issue is is about how do you stay relevant. And how do you think about new generations and relevance without losing your standards? And many of the arguments and the endless crises in the BBC are about the kind of wrestling with the topic of trying to stay relevant and trying somehow to appeal to lots of different people. I mean, I'll give you one example. I was the controller, i.e. the kind of programmer for one of the BBC's smaller television networks, BBC Two, on the night when Princess of Wales Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris. But it was a holiday weekend, and I was the most senior person they could find. And I get a phone call at 1 o'clock in the morning to say that she's been hurt and subsequently that she died. And I said to them, when was the last, this is 1997, when was the last major royal death? And they said, well, it was Mountbatten in 1979, but the last major one is King George VI, 1952, 45 years earlier. And I said, what's the plan? And the plan was essentially 3 weeks of martial music. That's not really an exaggeration. And they said, we've got a plan for the Queen Mum, you know. Sort of. And so in a way, the challenge there is, what does that, it's a gigantic emotional national event. What is it going to mean to people in the UK and around the world in 1997? And how can you start thinking about the kind of language of the way you do it, knowing that martial music isn't going to cut it? It's not going to be that. It's going to be, and how do you kind of conceive of and then build a kind of response to something like that, which works. It works for traditionalists. It works for new audiences. That's what you're wrestling with.
Well, except it does bring everybody together. I mean, regardless of whether you had enough material, we've all had, whether it's 9/11 or any events or the space shuttle blowing up. Everybody gathers around. You really bring everybody together for the first time. And we can still do it in the organization. I mean, on a more trivial level, the Super Bowl had the biggest audience in recent memory.
Yeah.
And you can bring people together. And your son will leave the darkened floor of his bedroom and come down to watch something. But
It's a really important point. The biggest events are getting bigger. The biggest live events. And music is very interesting, because music, live music and the sense of occasion of going to see live music is actually bigger than it used to be. How we're talking about disintermediation, and the record companies have been squeezed horribly, but artists are making a good living. And actually people are enjoying the experience of being collectively together to hear a band or to go to Glastonbury or whatever. So I think that business, the shared experience, it's happening in a different way, but major news stories and other big events like the Super Bowl are bringing people together in some ways as never before.
yeah, and the quality of the individuals are kind of startling. And people are much more independent and much less demanding for their parents, because for one thing, they know more than the parents. And it is slightly unnerving. And look, I'm 72, and my daughter asks for help with homework. It's a lost cause. I can just about read it. And this is a new phenomenon. I don't think there's ever been a time when kids were more independent. The millennials are astonishingly independent and understand that they're going to have to do it by themselves. I don't think my children think I'm going to get them a job.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think when we look at the global media revolution, I think there's some credit that can be claimed with respect to how intelligent the millennials are and how varied and diverse they are. But Mark, I was struck by your point, which seems quite correct, that big events are getting bigger and bringing people together maybe more than ever. But would you agree that that might be because there's so few occasions when they come together? They don't come together at the water cooler anymore to discuss Seinfeld. They don't come together to discuss events every day. There's not a shared vocabulary. And that is one of the reasons why a person holding a particular point of view in politics has no ability whatsoever to convince anyone else that his opinion is right and theirs is wrong.
If you go into the BBC, which was a shock when I first went to the BBC since joining the board, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of people sitting in front of computers. And computers, as far as the eye can see, that's a shared experience by accident. Yeah. It's not a shared experience in practice, and that's in the nature of what's going on. People communicate electronically. They don't communicate as much as they used to one-on-one. But it's just different. I don't think it's necessarily bad. It's just different, and you adapt or you get into trouble. The biggest question then is how many people get left behind, because to succeed today, the discipline that you have to have is going to be quite sophisticated, and the problem for the society is that the have-nots are going to find it much harder to have anything, and I think that's what politicians have to do something about.
Howard, are you suggesting, and I take it you may be, that when everyone's sitting at their computer, one of the things they're doing is they're on social media, and that social media and
it's very cynical.
Is the way that everyone is sharing experience, maybe that's a fact.
Yeah, maybe it is. They certainly communicate on Facebook to a level of which you would never have imagined an alternative. I mean, there is no equivalent of Facebook other than that, and I think it's quite startling how much communication they do. Now, all of us sort of hope that Facebook diminishes somewhat, because the level of discourse on Facebook is not terribly sophisticated or thoughtful, but it's communication.
And I guess, Mark, one of the things I wonder if the Times looks at, and I'm sure you look at everything, but is Facebook a competitor apart from that in terms of its aggregation? There are people, perhaps not Howard's son with his Harry Potter, but get their news on Facebook.
Yes, there are.
As well as their social.
No, there are, and it's a kind of it's an interesting debating point about whether in the end you want to be and you have to be present there, but the danger potentially is that if people can get snippets of what you do aggregated with snippets of other things, that you'll sort of disappear. There was a great worry a few years ago about Google News, that perhaps Google News would end up aggregating all the news in the world under the Google banner, and the rest of us would all disappear, and people would never notice the tiny letter saying BBC or New York Times. It doesn't seem to have happened, and the marketing effect of being there has been positive. But
Al Jazeera, I was watching Al Jazeera today.
Yeah.
I was kind of startled at the serious nature of Al Jazeera. I was sort of hoping it was terrible.
Al Jazeera America is rather good, isn't it?
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. They've got a documentary series. We talked about decline of documentaries. They have a 4-part documentary series on immigration that I thought was pretty impressive.
And I think Al Jazeera I mean, the Al Jazeera America is very interesting. I mean, you need deep pockets, and those guys have got deep pockets.
Yeah.
And so it's backed, people will know, by sovereign money from from Qatar in the Gulf, and cost them, I think, please don't quote me on this, but around $500 million to buy the cable slot to get from Al Gore essentially to get the distribution. But I think Al Jazeera America is a good example of actually positive choice in the market. Yeah. That's a different perspective of news of the world, which it would not have been available to American TV viewers 25 years ago.
As we survey all the things we could discuss, one of the things that the New York Times was noted for years ago was a famous case involving the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah.
And so now we have Snowden, we have Pentagon Papers and Snowden, and how would you describe the difference, if any, between the Times reaction?
I'm not sure there is a difference, really. And it's quite interesting. A lot of people, in a sense, get this slightly wrong. I mean, Edward Snowden has done something which, is a very familiar story, which is he got some information. Many people obviously debate whether he should have taken it and so forth. But rather than simply putting it up on the web, he decided to contact a number of reputable news organizations. Ultimately, the New York Times was one of them. Initially, it was the Washington Post, the Guardian, the not-for-profit ProPublica, and to ask them to figure out, given their values and standards, which parts of the information he had should be made public. And that, to me, is very much in the same spirit of the Pentagon Papers. And what's interesting, and the WikiLeaks story is somewhat different, but again, it's true that WikiLeaks ended up working with a consortium of newspapers, the New York Times, the Guardian, La Repubblica, El País, and so on, Le Monde, on again, which parts of this is it in the public interest to publish. Particularly when one hears, spokespeople for the authorities talking, you get the sense of a completely irresponsible, unlimited publication. Actually, it's been quite a targeted thing. Partly, it must be said, because the amount of information is so great that nobody yet knows what's in it. It's too big to parse and understand, except over time. So I think, oddly enough, I think that although this is another example of the very different world we're in, where a young computer engineer can get on a thumb drive, information, confidential information on an absolutely gargantuan scale, and just kind of walk out with it. I think in a way, the way that the Snowden story has played out is really not unlike the story of the Pentagon Papers.
It's also not clear that if I asked everybody in the room, tell us what the horrible impact of Snowden has. What's the worst impact of Snowden? What specific information has been catastrophic or destructive? And I don't think people actually know. I think in principle, people talk about spies who are killed and information that has wrecked the strategy of any particular aspect of the Defense Department or so forth. I don't think actually anybody really knows. There are no secrets, and I suppose we're going to have to adjust to the idea that there aren't very many secrets.
That's right. But what Howard says is right, and you know, the procedure certainly at the New York Times and at the BBC would be if you were in possession of information which you were proposing to publish, is that you would go to the authorities. We do go to the authorities, explain what we're proposing to publish, ask them to comment, but also give them an opportunity if they want to make a case why publication is not in the public interest or might lead to risk to life and limb, to make that case. And although, you know, I think the standard of proof we would require is quite high, there are examples, which themselves are controversial, of the New York Times agreeing not to publish because the intelligence authorities or somebody else in government has made a case that it will be damaging. And again, the BBC from time to time has agreed not to publish something because of a specific danger to life and limb.
Well, certainly we all know who did publish faster and sooner there. And I think you make a very good case for the Times having a continuum of responsible decision-making in this area.
And more generally, although it's important to be timely, it's important to be, and if you're not timely with the news, you know, in the end, readers quite reasonably are going to say, what's the point? But we would never want to be so desperate to be first that we get the story wrong or do something irresponsible. I mean, the point is, one of the ways in which news has changed is we know who's going to be first with the news, and the answer is Twitter. The news is always going to be on Twitter first. You know, it's no longer really a race between professional outlets. Twitter's there. But the point about Twitter is, it's not just the news, everything else is pouring out at the same time. And our job has changed in a way from being the first with the news to being, if we can, the first people to really make sense of it and check it and make sure it's right and try and put it in context. That's what we try and do now.
Now, Howard said that one of the things that Snowden demonstrated, and you said about the thumb drive, that there are no secrets. The government cannot keep a secret because someone can always get to it. But Snowden also demonstrated and was trying to demonstrate, and perhaps the most important thing many people would say that he did demonstrate, was that none of us have any secrets because the government is collecting such massive information that is fully available and waiting only someone or some algorithm to analyze.
Well, the sheer volume of information is an odd form of protection. When Sony was very early, one of the companies was caught. People were admitting stealing produce and so forth and so on, and it really didn't turn out to be terribly important, and there wasn't very much money. But we were on the front pages of the newspapers for about 6 weeks, and it didn't add up to an awful lot. But the excitement in newspapers was about the exposure, but it didn't really add up to very much. And we found out that people, mostly the biggest single problem with people do email on everything and get in trouble. I mean, I used to see emails where somebody would send emails and say, don't do this, don't tell Steve Jobs that his batteries are screwed up. Don't tell so-and-so. And you say, well, please don't write that kind of email. and don't, whatever you do, don't tell so-and-so that we're not going to do this. But you couldn't do it. But there's so much of it. There's so much information. Years ago, I was in Russia, Soviet Union, and I had I was going to steal some caviar, and I put it outside the window on the window sill and said, well, I'm going to go away with this caviar. And they caught it. The Secret Service or whoever is responsible, the police caught it. And I thought, well, if that's the best espionage agency in the world can get my caviar back, then maybe there's so much information it's not such a bad deal. And that's certainly true in Russian. They had so many people listening to so many phone calls in the early days of the 60s and 70s. They were bored to death and probably shortened the war.
Which perhaps is the situation all governments find themselves in now,
Yeah.
with digital access to everything that everyone writes.
Well, the other problem they've got is that they've got such vast systems now. That, I mean, you know, an intelligence agency which maybe even still today, when they're trying to recruit a field agent, you know, that was Howard got tapped on the shoulder at some point, and you know, positive vetting. You know, they talk to your school teachers. Before you get sent out into the field, you're carefully segregated, so you only know so much. Meanwhile, the same intelligence agency, they need sort of 3,000 computer engineers to start next Monday just to keep the system going, and they can't use the same kind of security. And some of these kids, it turns out, have been seeing not just one part of the information, but everything on every system. So there's something about how those intelligence agencies are also wrestling and sometimes almost drowning under the colossal amount of data they're trying to process. And one of the unintended consequences is a lack of the kind of care they've historically taken about their employees in the IT department.
Somebody told me the other day that Rodin, when I was growing up, dating someone from Rodin was everybody's aspiration from some of us. And 50% of Rodin is now Asian. So how can you keep anything secret? I mean, you've got half your institution is Chinese anyway. You might as well stop pretending to hide information. And I think I'm told that Rodin in particular has a problem because they don't have a cultural ability to understand what's going on at a school like that. So they don't play they don't play sports. They don't contribute. They go off and do their own thing. So the world is changing very dramatically, and I don't know that you can do much about it. I mean, I suppose schools take the money and run.
Well, speaking of take the money and run, all the way through, we've been alluding to the business challenges, the commercial challenges that these changes present, and are presented to you throughout your careers, what you stick with, what you don't. But obviously, for everyone, one of the things you need to have, I assume, is people, and trained, educated people. I assume the Times doesn't have much problem getting people, journalists, well-trained journalists who want to work there. But how many journalists are going to be left a couple of years from now?
Well, I mean, our newsroom is the same size as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. We need, over time, the New York Times newsroom has been, the kind of mix of talent has been changing. The overwhelming majority of people are straightforward writing journalists. They're reporters and editors who deal with language, and they do their journalism by writing it. But we need more now. We need great designers. We need great computer scientists and engineers. We need data engineers. We need many other graphics artists and so on. I mean, to me, the big gulf, I mean, the Times, Sony Pictures, which was part of Howard's bailiwick when he was running Sony both in Tokyo and before that in the US. These are content institutions. The BBC is a content institution. They know how to recruit, how to train, how to inspire people of creativity and gifts in content. What's interesting is that's a very different, Howard and I were talking before this started about Silicon Valley and the sense of thinking about content as something that you can parse with algorithms and you can kind of weigh by the kilo and buy and sell. And, you know, I think there is a real difference between institutions, the point of which is human talent. And, you know, they're often difficult people. They're people with their own personal agenda about what they want to do. You know, and you're always trying to find a way of getting their agenda and your agenda pointing in roughly the same direction. And there's an awful lot of the business of how do you manage and encourage individuals to give of their best, and individual stars. And that's a very different world than the world of Silicon Valley. And I still think there's a great prize for the institution which can get these two worlds to work effectively together.
Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post, the first instinct was for people to be defensive about that. And I spoke to some Washington Post people. The Washington Post is in serious decline. You were stealing many of the writers to work for the New York Times. But the mood of the Washington Post has improved considerably.
Right.
And I don't know what Jeff Bezos is going to do with the Washington Post, but he clearly loves the idea of having content.
Yeah.
And whatever he does it would be ridiculous to be cynical about that, because he's a smart man and he spent an awful lot of money acquiring the Washington Post, and who knows what, maybe he'll fix it. There are smart people out there, and he's one of them, and I'm quite stunned that he wants to run a newspaper. Most of them, Steve Jobs, bless him, or Apple sitting on $50 billion, and Microsoft sitting on $60 billion. And Jeff Bezos is spending money on refining content. That's a good sign.
Yeah. But all of them, I was talking to Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple, just a couple of weeks ago. The exceptional content, content which really does feel like it's special, whether it's a great Hollywood movie, or it's some of the great cable television that we're seeing in the US at the moment, or whether it's great journalism from The Economist or The New Yorker or the New York Times or The Washington Post. I think the smartest people in Silicon Valley understand that it's really worth something. And I think that the way people will have seen Reed Hastings of Netflix move from the business of big output deals, big kind of rights deals for content, to individual commissions. And I do think that it's very early days. They haven't commissioned many. I'm not saying that they're the ones who are going to win completely, but I think that House of Cards and the House of Cards story, commissioned not by one of the obvious, quality giants of cable, HBO or Showtime, but commissioned by Netflix and made available a complete series at a time, so you can just watch all the way through at a time. Thought that did feel like an interesting, in some ways, positive development.
Yeah, I'm less enthusiastic about that. But then again,
You don't like Kevin Spacey?
No, I know I like Kevin fine, but that's a triumph of marketing. I mean, they've produced 5 movies. It's a little early to be getting excited because 3 of them didn't work and 2 did.
Yeah.
And the one you're talking about was built on the backs of existing businesses. It's not an original piece of work. It's a redefinition of an existing problem. But I think I
don't disagree with that.
It's an amazing time, and it keeps changing. And I suppose we should briefly talk about Barry Diller's Aereo, where he's creating a digital antenna that will allow for $8 streaming content of the networks, and those who don't like that are saying, well, basically he's stealing copyright and he's stealing content, and we're still waiting to find out whether the Supreme Court thinks this is a good idea or not.
Do people know about Aereo? Everyone here never? Some people. So it's a very, very clever. It's a wickedly clever idea. So it's always been traditionally allowed that you should be able to put up an aerial and get broadcast TV down the aerial. So Aereo, the company Aereo, produces an array of thousands of tiny aerials, tiny ones, each one of which then it goes into, as it were, into the internet, and you can subscribe. So it's kind of, in quotes, your aerial, even though it's in a central array, and it offers you essentially on-demand and sophisticated services based on soaking up the whole of broadcast TV and then giving it to you down a tube, but crucially, without any of the broadcasters being paid anything. And it all works because citizens are allowed to have an aerial. So why can't Aereo have your your own personal aerial for you? And so the networks are terrified that in big cities.
So the cable companies, because your cable companies have an option now that retransmission consent is no longer relevant, and so they're saying, well, we won't pay it. And then the networks say, well, look, we've spent a fortune on creating all this programming, and it means nothing. So it's going to be another war that we talked about earlier, the disintermediation, when just because something worked fine doesn't mean somebody else can't walk in and throw it up in the air and start all over again.
And the great thing, John, is because this is America, it's all going to end up in the courts. And it'll end up in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Because, and this point about, well, is it right or wrong that, as it were, the law which allows an individual to have an aerial to receive a free-to-air broadcast TV, is it okay for that to be transferred to a company to do it on an industrial scale?
Everybody panics. I mean, it's not clear yet that it will work, and it's not clear that that people will want that alternative. You don't get cable, you miss a lot of programming, it's streamed and so forth. But it is another... But
it seems to me that anyone who knows Barry Diller would confirm the sheer mischief of the idea would be the reason he would have invested
and what's
in
the
it.
worst could happen? People could pay him off.
And Howard, of course, you know very well personally, having lived through it, that this is just a repeat of what happened in the music business.
Yes, it's so sad.
And
I mean, we all fight. We began this conversation by talking about how you fight to protect something that you created and made, and there's nothing particularly wrong with that, except that history has said, no, it's time people can come along and take what's yours, and take what you invented, and it's okay. And music was a classic. I mean, I loved our music company, and all of a sudden, people said music should be free. And that's really the blueprint for so much that's happened in the last 10 years. And everybody said, well, it should be free because you charge too much money. And so it goes on in ever decreasing circles, and you end up making less money and killing yourself.
this is getting very close to a point where we want to let the audience ask some questions. But let me just ask you all to conclude whether, other than this development, is there anything else you see coming down the pike in the next 3 or 4 years that is going to really be a major new element in this revolution?
Well, I touched briefly on education.
Yes.
I think that what's striking is how little effective education has been so far, really. And I think, again, there's potential, and the universities are beginning to play with the idea of what it could mean, potentially in terms of growing their ability to reach students and maybe to do some version of distance learning with some of the components of what they do. But I think education potentially could be a further very, very substantial kind of, but this is a revolution which is going to touch everything. There's very, very few industries. I mean, it should be clear to you that we're just on the verge now of cars essentially becoming computers with wheels, which are themselves constantly online. There's virtually nothing which is not going to be somehow connected. Most of the devices in the house, in the apartment, are going to be connected. So it's not yet complete, but we're going to live in a completely wired online world.
Yeah, I mean, there's the dean of the Oxford University Business School. I don't know if he's still in the room, but I think the business school, which when we were students, many of us here were students, the last thing anyone would have done would have gone to business schools, and yet the business school has moved in Oxford has moved from beyond just being a kind of academic exercise and teaching business in one way to a place that's inventing education, reinventing education about business as it relates to other disciplines at Oxford, because both the Chinese and everybody else has figured out that as the world changes, you have to know more, and the business schools have more to offer now than just an academic exercise. The entrepreneurial energy of a society is going to rescue the economy, particularly in the UK and particularly in the United States. And I'm helping to do this, even though I'm ill-equipped to do so. But I just think it's very exciting that the opportunity for the educational business to offer something quite distinct and different from anything that's been thought of for the last 40 years. You couldn't finish a conversation about talking about going to business school 40 years ago, but the people who are there now are working together with medicine, other disciplines in the university to use the business, the entrepreneurial energies of a society to create things that the society absolutely needs. And I think that's the future, and I think it's very exciting. And I'm very impressed with the Dean. Hopefully he's not here, that he won't be overwhelmed.
He is, but I think that it's very possible to end a discussion like this with gloom and doom, because there are a lot of people that see a lot of gloom and doom. I think it's really encouraging that our two speakers really ended on a high note. Education, maybe the next area where the global media digital revolution will have a major impact, and no one said and it's going to be terrible. So I think that's great. Now, let me turn to you all. I know everyone has had lots of questions they would like to ask at various points during this, and I hope you remember what it was you wanted to ask.
Check, please.
Nick?
Well, thank you for a very entertaining, provocative conversation, all three of you. It's terrific. So surely the question that John would have asked, if he hadn't so generously opened up to the floor, was a question of what is the impact of the media revolution on the essence of our humanity? And specifically, we really haven't had any conversation about privacy. And is there a role in the media, a responsibility to look after privacy, or should we just get over it? It can't possibly exist anymore. And then second,
I don't think we were that negative. I think we see the role, privacy is an important issue. I don't disagree with that.
do we have any basis, I guess, given the availability of information for individuals to believe they have any reasonable expectation of privacy? And then the flip side of that is something that you suggested, is that maybe people are communicating quite a bit, but in an increasingly interconnected world, we seem to be living alone. I'm thinking about the 4 people at the restaurant sitting at the same table looking down at their devices.
Wait, feel free.
Well, these are both gigantic topics, aren't they? I mean, privacy. I mean, to me, the conundrum is to what extent do we think about privacy as something which has got to be protected through a combination of kind of censorship and legal restraint, and to what extent should it be a personal, something which is really, in a sense, about the demand side, about the public, and trying to. I mean, I found myself recently. Somebody gave me an article in Vanity Fair, which was about the Murdoch's marriage, Rupert and Wendy Murdoch's marriage, and after a couple of paragraphs, I thought, I don't want to read this. It's not, it's not right.
You
There's
did
no.
too.
I put it down. I haven't read it because in the end, I think there are certain things which, even if frankly one of the actors wants to make it public, which don't feel like you should read it. Now, there's a big debate in the UK about whether or not there should be more draconian press regulation, specifically to, well, one of the objects of it will be to protect privacy. I have to say, and I kind of assume that in some way, and I gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry, that probably some level of press regulation was needed to protect privacy. Living in America for a year or so, I've begun to wonder whether, in the end, the pressures on press freedom, which are great here and they're great in the UK and great around the world, aren't such that there's a real risk that you start off with a good intention of trying to protect the privacy of individuals, and you end up actually restraining proper journalism. So I ended up being slightly more libertarian on the topic of privacy. But again, I go back to values, and I think the fact that if we can, we need to inculcate people with values to discriminate about what it's appropriate to read, because I think the reality is an awful lot of private information is going to be available. The bowling alone point, I think I'm going to leave to Howard to answer.
The what?
the bowling alone, the four people in the restaurant, each of them head down on the device.
Yeah, it's very Japanese. You can routinely in Japan see four people on their own cell phones, not talking to each other. But I sometimes, actually, from my experience in Japan, I sometimes think that Japan is quietly going through its own reaction to this world. I don't think there's much enthusiasm for the Brave New World. I sometimes think that Japan experienced being the number one economy in the world, or the second economy in the world, and there doesn't seem to be a considerable amount of enthusiasm for going that direction, and that life is pretty good in Japan, that the quality of life is more important than the sheer insane ambition that they remember from 20 years ago. And I think I'm interested that Japan is going in a different direction. Japan is not, they're not coming to the United States to study anymore. Whatever precipitated the energy to be who they were 10 years ago, which is an enormously successful society, I think that you're showing a country that's rejecting something about the world that we've spent the last hour talking about. Maybe that's superficial, but I have a real sense of it. I think people in Japan that I spent a lot of time with say, Japan's the best country in the world. We don't need all this. And I have a feeling that America's too enthusiastic about commerce, too greedy, too everything. And maybe what we've got is actually pretty good. And Japan, nobody ever asked me for a raise when I was running Sony, which is kind of startling. And people do what they feel is more important. There's a sense of that things are more important than the rush to accumulate wealth or the rush to accumulate anything. Yeah. And I don't know what that means. It's too soon to know that, but maybe the world will change. We talk about the energy with which people are racing forward and building this and building that and building that. How long can it go on? I mean, maybe there's a limit.
And the other, I mean, I think it strikes me is, I mean, tomorrow morning, my eldest son is an undergraduate at Harvard. He will gather, he'll go to 8 o'clock in the morning to an Irish bar. They won't get alcohol, it'll be a cup of coffee or a glass of water. And there'll be probably 20 or 30 of them. Some of them will be students, some of them will be other people, some of them will be Brits, some of them will be Irish, some of them will be Americans. And they will sit together and they'll watch Liverpool playing Manchester City. Big match, Anfield. And they'll get together, physically together, in front of the same TV. They could all be watching it on their computer screens. They'll go to the place, they'll have their scarves, they'll bring their red scarves, and it will be a human moment. And it's something which couldn't have happened because it wouldn't have been available five years ago, 10 years ago on the TV. And so I think sometimes you get communities which are it'll be fun for them. And it will feel not quite like standing on the, sitting on the cop, but they'll feel they're halfway to being in Liverpool to watch it happen. So sometimes I think we're seeing some communities which are enabled by all of this rather than communities which are destroyed by it.
I think the millennials are about as interesting a group as you can possibly imagine. They're not like our generation. They're not like the baby boomers. They're much more seemingly independent, and the change is so fast that the rest of us can't keep up anyway, so let them go.
And it's not often that friendship, friends and friendship, and your duty to your friends looms larger for them than I think it did for people of my generation.
Yeah. Well, people in Japan more and more people live at home because they're making that choice. They're living at home because it's too expensive to do anything else. They're not coming to American universities the way they used to, and they're reinventing their lives and suggesting perhaps that there's a better way to live. I mean,
Please. I'm sorry, the lady has taken over. Susan?
Is this on? Yeah. I was struck by your comment about values in response to Nick asking about privacy, because you talk about the next generation and the Twitter and all the things their social media, the things they talk about publicly are horrifying to our generation in some ways, because they find that that's good things to share. They share some of the most private things, or things we think of as private. And going back to the values, the question that I have, when you're talking about the amount of choice for content, some of that choice is just not just poor content, but wrong. And some of that leads a lot of people to make conclusions that are pretty scary. Right now, there's a big movement about young families not wanting to inoculate their children, thinking that that has something to do with autism, and other ideas that spread quickly. So how does one manage that content? How do we all going forward figure out what is real and what isn't in that content? Because it's very cluttered.
So I think that's incredibly interesting. I guess what I was trying to say is, in a way, I think it's futile to imagine that we can or should even want to kind of control or limit the supply, except when things become essentially criminal. That in countries where free speech is allowed, claiming that you have evidence that the MMR vaccine leads to autism it may be wrong-headed and may be pernicious, but it's not something that you can either should seek to prevent being put on the internet, or realistically have got a hope in hell of preventing people who want to see it from finding on the internet. So I think the whole issue has to move to the demand side and trying to equip citizens with the faculties and the common sense, what Aristotle calls, I think, phronesis, the common sense of humanity, to judge between what is sensible, what is wise, what is based on evidence, what you should take seriously, and what is crap and should be ignored or denigrated and criticised.
Thank you. Please.
Ooh, somebody has a bottle.
You have to wait another 10 minutes.
It was an encouraging chink there.
Please.
Well, you talked a little bit about privacy and the pressures that go along with government surveillance, but I'm curious as to your views. We all have tablets, phones, computers that with analytics of various sorts and cookies and web beacons. We voluntarily or involuntarily give up a great deal of information to the media as content providers, and I'm curious as to where you think that data and the prudent use of it and privacy issues from that standpoint are going in the future.
I don't know.
The question is really, I take it about the data that we willingly, in quotes, share every time we go online or make a purchase or do anything else online. And what's going to happen? Is there a way to regulate the use of that?
Well, I mean, first, I think it's, if you are, as virtually every company is now, a recipient of this data, and particularly such boring things as people's credit card numbers and addresses and telephone numbers and so forth, it's a terrifying responsibility because for the reasons that we've talked about, trying to make sure that information is secure and can't be got at is very, very difficult. And the threat to people, criminals and others, getting that information, that kind of picture of threat and kind of cat and mouse between the people who are trying to maintain the security and the people who are trying to break the security is ongoing. And responsible companies do their level best, but it's so I think as a matter of practicality, it's in what they call the risk registers. It's moved from not being an issue at all to being very, very close to the top of the list of risks.
It's kind of ironic that the Chinese, the Chinese seem to make it clear that we're the only ones who do it. And the cynicism with which we read about everybody complaining about the United States, how much the United States are investigating other people's business, it's now the shape of things to come. I mean, there are thousands and thousands in both China and India and everywhere, thousands of computer programmers busy trying to find out what we're doing. And we're doing it. And I think the only thing we can hope for is that they're too busy to find anything.
Yeah. I mean, George Orwell kind of half foresaw this in 1984. The bit he didn't foresee was that the citizens would be so keen to share information about themselves. I mean, the real Winston Smith is is only too happy to. There's a he calls it a telescreen in the book. There's a screen with a camera in the apartment, so he can perform in front of the cameras. Our citizens like to and it's amazing how easily you can convince people that Snapchat means that you can send an embarrassing photograph of yourself and it'll disappear. Oh, will it?
Yeah, I think T.S. Eliot said a long time ago, he said, what will happen in the world is that we will all be endlessly communicating.
Yeah.
It was incredibly prophetic.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps one more question.
Endlessly having dinner is what I'm looking forward to.
Well,
Hello. I am coming from Pakistan and studying at Oxford. I think that I bring a slightly different perspective because there is a lot of concern over here about how information may be damaging. But I will tell you that in a country like Pakistan, where our cook now knows about Lady Gaga, is not necessarily a bad thing. And the reason is because I feel that information, especially in that part of the world, is power. And the unavailability of information has somehow prevented people from asking for rights and social advancement. My only concern, though, is that, and this goes back to, here's my question, is that I think that in not communicating with people sitting next to us at dinner, we are communicating increasingly with people all over the world. And sometimes it prevents us from understanding ground realities. For example, in Pakistan, in the elections, Imran Khan was the big winner, according to Facebook people, but he wasn't the big winner in the rural areas, and everyone thought he was going to have a landslide, and he lost badly in the elections. So I guess my question to you is, even though there is a lot of information available, there is still a lot of class and economic, social strata differences in the availability of information. And how fast do you think that is going to become a level playing field with the same information to everyone across the world?
Whoever says predicting is very hard, especially when it's about the future. I think the only thing you can hope for is things are getting better. I mean, we're not solving the world's problems, and it turns out we're not. I mean, look, we've got all kinds of problems in places we never had problems, the Ukraine and so forth. We keep finding more and more places there are problems and difficulties. I think we all do the best, and nothing is going to happen in a hurry. But the world's expectations are very high that things should hurry, and it's just not possible. We just keep plowing on.
So, and in a way, the Trojan horse is not the computer. It's the mobile phone. I mean, it may be that people will look back in 100 years at this era as the era of the mobile phone, one of the aspects of which was its computing power, rather than thinking of this as the age of the computer. And I think that across the developing world, mobile phones, which started off, I used to say mobile, but I've learned people laugh at me in this country, so I say mobile now. The kind of dumb mobile phones are very rapidly going to become smartphones. And, for a time, the most sophisticated industrial developing countries like China will be able to continue to create firewalls which are successful to a degree in limiting information. But I think that's only a timing issue. And in many parts of the developing world, even that will prove very difficult. And I think there will be the means for people to get information across the developing world, throughout South Asia, throughout Africa, and Southeast Asia. That is happening and will go on happening. Again, I think there are quite tough questions, though, about whether or not, when that happens, the way this cornucopia of information is going to arrive and how people will make sense of it in these societies rapidly, I think still remain issues. But I think that the actual practical means of getting the information is going to be pretty much ubiquitous around the world because people will have a $20 smartphone.
I did a documentary. My first documentary in 1974 was about the Middle East. And I spent a lot of time in traveling all over the Middle East, in Lebanon and Jordan and Israel and so forth, and did a documentary, an attempt to explain what was happening in the Middle East. And I came to the conclusion then, in my wisdom, was that a West Bank state was the best solution. And it was 1974. It's all those years away. Things don't get changed very quickly.
Howard and Mark, it has been a pleasure for me to be able to sit so closely with you as you shared so much wisdom about this very, very important subject.
Hasn't laid a finger on me.
And I should point out that Howard complained at the very outset that he thought he was at a severe disadvantage because he was sharing the platform with two Jesuit-educated participants, and I agreed with him. He is. But thank you very much. I know the warden wants to bring things to a close and to thank both of you.